Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Tracy Harkin. Tracy is, according to my notes, the Iona NI spokesperson, but in fact she is Iona. She does tremendous work for the organization. She really is a fantastic activist in so many different fields, and I think we're so lucky to have her and for the work that she has done for Iona. I said earlier that herself and Mary Lewis have stormed the commanding heights of the media, and I think that that is very, very true. And there is a very long and sustained battle for all of us to continue in relation to the media. But Tracy has done us proud and built up a very firm relationship between Iona and the media at large. So we're very, very grateful to her for all of her work. Tracy Harkin.
Do you want to just do that now? It doesn't come on to thing. I thought if I came up a wee bit earlier, Alvin's words might be a little bit shorter, but he's very good. He always gives a very good introduction to everybody, so thank you, Alvin. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be speaking to you today on its, I think what we all knew in our hearts, and I think today has really sort of confirmed in us just how important this topic is. It's a very timely topic. It's big news. The whole right to die movement is making great advances in many countries throughout the world. And as the other speakers have said earlier today, end-of-life care is something that we all need to face at some stage in our life. And from my own personal perspective, like Vicky and like many other parents, with our daughter was diagnosed with a life-limiting condition, it was something that myself and my husband had to face as parents much earlier in our stage in life than we had hoped as well. And in the case of our own little daughter, as we've heard earlier, she actually is, like some other children, not many, but some, has defied all medical expectations. And despite her prognosis, she is just a beautiful, funny, mischievous, happy little girl that just loves life and is highly interactive with her brothers and sisters. But sooner or later, my husband Tom and I, we know that we will be making end-of-life decisions for her. End-of-life decisions, though, very different from life-ending decisions. And we just need to really, really be very, very tuned into that. And I hope today has went some way towards that. But through Wee Kathleen, I have had the privilege of meeting many parents like Vicky who've lost their little ones, and I've gained a much deeper insight into the huge difference a good hospice and palliative care can provide. And I remember the first time I was invited as a parent up to the Children's Hospice in Newton Abbey. And it was very tentative because I hadn't really much experience of hospice care, and I didn't really want Kathleen to go there initially because for me hospices were places were sad places where people died essentially. And I couldn't have been more wrong actually, because the atmosphere that met me when I first visited there was a very joyous one, a very peaceful one. And it's a very joyous atmosphere, because many children like Kathleen, despite very serious prognoses and despite living with very serious disabilities and illnesses, they do much better. And in fact, the Children's Hospice Horizon House in Newton Abbey now is actually essentially very much a respite centre where families like myself can avail, where Kathleen can go. I always say she's going on her little holiday. She has a few nights every few months. And it's not much because there's such a demand for it now, but it makes a huge difference to us. And, and it's also like a kind of sanctuary for parents when that final time does come, that if they're afraid to be in their own home or feel a bit overwhelmed in their own home with their child who's passing away, they can go to the hospice and really be surrounded by very caring and supportive and experienced staff. But the hospice movement has really transformed the way society now cares for the dying. The idea being that those with terminal illness shouldn't see themselves as burdensome or unwanted. And Cicely Saunders is a British founder of the hospice movement. And she explained it beautifully, I think, when she said that people should be in circles of love. and care, where they'll be made valued and comfortable. A phrase of hers was, "While hospitals cure, hospices care." And she was very much into pain relief, the importance of palliative care. And it's really through her pioneering work, actually, that she got lots of other medical professionals involved in it. And a major, and she also had a lovely phrase where she said, "Last days are not lost days." And I think we've heard that very much from Father Andrew there and from Vicky's testimony today as well. But in this part of the world, we have excellent palliative care because we haven't legalised for euthanasia or assisted suicide. And leading palliative care specialists in Ireland and the UK, like Tony O'Brien or Dr. Robert George, have spoken out strongly in opposition to any changes in our law here. And I suppose I should put on the PowerPoint at some stage. Where's the clicker? Is it all ready to go, Gavin? Okay. Let's see. Is that it? So, but the Right to Die movement has gained momentum, and if you can see there, it's now sort of spread to many countries throughout the world. And part of this conversation, unfortunately, and I have the lovely job of doing this today, is to highlight sort of the darkness, because we can only see the light sometimes in very clear terms. We need to be very much aware of what has happened in other countries when the law has been changed. So it's legal in a variety of countries. It's supported by some NGOs and other advocacy organisations. And, you know, you'll see here shortly as well in the UK, there's the Noel Conway case is rearing its head again. And so there's constant push, constant pressure for us to change our laws using, of course, the sort of very hard cases. So how on earth does something as horrible, really, and you'll see that more and more throughout my presentation, Eamon Gaines referred to it, how can something so horrible have become so accepted? And one of the reasons, I suppose, is the very persuasive language that the Right to Die movement use. So what are their claims? Well, they use words like medical aid in dying. That's actually the name of the bill in Quebec. Death with dignity. There's even an act called the Completed Life Act in Belgium. So the language that's often used by proponents of law change is very, very emotional. It draws on people's natural compassion. It's what I call the language of illusion, a very elusive language. And we need to be very, very clear when we hear this language. We need to be exactly what's been proposed. And it's understandable. It's very wrong, but it's understandable how some legislators and even some medical professionals do become convinced that legalising euthanasia was, in the past, a compassionate thing to do. I don't think that view can hold weight now, though, because we actually have seen more and more the evidence of it. So assurances are given that it will be rare. That it will be rare, and that there will be safeguards against abuse, and the expected uptake, the projections given of the prospective uptake are always very, very low. But in reality, the very opposite has been true. And so we look at Belgium and the Netherlands. We can't look at all the countries, but let's see. So in Belgium, euthanasia was legalised in 2002. And by 2003, there were just over 200 cases. But by 2016, this has rocketed to over 2,000 cases, an almost ninefold increase, or an increase of 860%. In 2014, euthanasia in Belgium has been made available to children. And we're told that these children are, they have to be categorised as terminally ill and, expected to die within 6 months or so, as if that makes it any better. So a very worrying thing in terms of the safeguards not actually happening is that only 54% of deaths are actually reported. In Belgium and the Netherlands, assisted suicide was originally made available for terminal illness only, but soon the law was changed to include non-terminal conditions, including psychiatric mental illnesses. And in 2015, a study by the British Medical Journal studied 100 patients who had requested euthanasia, and not one was terminally ill. So we can see how very, very quickly things can change. Oops. There we go. So now on to the Netherlands. Another very grim story. The Netherlands legalised euthanasia in 2001. The number of euthanasia and assisted deaths went from 1,800 in 2002, to 6,091 in 2016. So in this case, a 324% increase. And in just 14 years, despite reassurances at the very beginning that it would be rare. And again, like in Belgium, grounds have widened to take in non-terminal conditions. For example, in 2016, 141 people were killed because of dementia, 60 for psychiatric reasons, and 244 for advanced age. And these figures are actually incomplete. In 2012, The Lancet reported a study which indicated that 23% of all assisted deaths were unreported. This gives us an estimation of around 1,400 unreported cases in 2016. And a recent study found that in the Flemish part of Belgium, 66 of 208 cases of euthanasia occurred in the absence of request or consent. So it's absolutely dreadful what's happening, open to huge abuse. And this is this type of thing that we need to highlight on the media when we're asked to discuss the assisted dying issue. We need to talk about the beauty of palliative care and proper care, like what the hospice movement provide, but also we need to shed a light on how dark things can get very quickly in these other European countries. In Belgium, nearly half of all cases of euthanasia are not reported to the Federal Control and Evaluation Committee. The legal requirements, they're there in paper, but not in practice. They're very frequently not met, and unreported cases, they're very frequently not met in unreported cases than in reported cases. And a written request for euthanasia, which is part of what the stipulations were at the beginning, was absent in 88% of cases. Dozens of disabled children have been killed under the Groningen protocol in the Netherlands. I think you might have heard about that scandal. Now and again, these things will hit the headlines for a day or so, and then we'll forget about them, despite the fact that this is illegal. And I think this is a very sad quote here. This is a quotation by the Royal Dutch Medical Association, where they declared in 2006, they declared that being over the age of 70 and tired of living should be an acceptable reason for requesting euthanasia. And now and again, something will hit the headlines, like the deaf twin brothers that decided in their 40s that life just wasn't living, and they were each given a lethal injection and died. Or the lady with Alzheimer's who was held down against her will. That was another case that hit the headlines. So non-voluntary euthanasia without an explicit request from the patient is also permitted, and this has twice been criticised by the United Nations Human Rights Committee. In fact, it's interesting that in Belgium a couple of years ago, 230 doctors took out a full-page ad in one of their daily newspapers saying, look, this has gone too far, we are not going to perform euthanasia on dementia patients. So there's some signs that people are waking up in that country. So let's look at Quebec, because Quebec's an interesting one. They introduced euthanasia in 2015. And again, it's called the Medical Aid in Dying Act. Doesn't that sound so lovely? So promises of advocates of the law included that it would be exceptional, that there would be safeguards to prevent abuse, and that there'd be very strict criteria to protect vulnerable people. And proponents claimed it was first and foremost a law about access to quality palliative care throughout the province. So we need to be so tuned in when we hear these types of claims in our part of the world. The facts are very, very different. So after just 2 years, comparisons are already being made with the Belgian experience. Advocates predicted around 100 requests in the first year, but in fact 469 people died in 2015, the first year of the Act, and 638 people died by euthanasia in 2017. In Oregon, legalized assisted euthanasia, in Oregon, legalized assisted suicide, as it's called there, was introduced in 1998, and the numbers quadrupled in 12 years. And so, as we can see very quickly, why does it happen that the right to die becomes very much a duty to die? It's a wee bit like the abortion debate, in the fact that once you legalize something, law transforms the culture. So where women in crisis pregnancy will feel that, that expectation, because it's legal, it must be something good and decent. They will go for abortion. The same at the end of life. Once it's legal, elderly people, the infirm, and even some family members might get together and decide, well, actually, it's best for mum or for dad if their life's ended now. So it's extremely worrying. In the Oregon case, 1 in 4 people seeking assisted suicide are clinically depressed. Most are over 75 years of age, And the reasons given include inability to participate in enjoyable activities. That's one of the reasons it's also given. And in the first year of the Oregon law, 15% said that being a burden was a main motivation. And 7 years later, this reason of being a burden rose to over 30%. So it's the total opposite of affirming laws and laws that affirm human dignity. So this is what do they say? What are the proponents of euthanasia still saying despite this evidence? And this is Giles Jennicott, who's a lawyer and co-chairman of the Euthanasia Control and Evaluation Committee, which oversees the practice in Belgium. And he says the law humanises the deaths of terminally ill patients on the one hand. On the other hand, for patients who are not terminally ill but are completely hopeless, there is a respect to individual autonomy. See that focus on individual autonomy. I think it's a major advance, he says, in the way society, law and philosophy see this very important issue. Perhaps we should send him a copy of today's recordings from these other philosophers. Another very important person, Jacques Attali, former president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, has said, as soon as he goes beyond 60 to 65 years of age, man lives beyond his capacity to produce, and he costs society a lot of money. Euthanasia will be one of the essential instruments of our future societies. This is actually what people are saying in very, very influential positions. Have any of you ever seen the movie Me Before You? So that's another just chilling factor there regarding the law and culture, which I'll just read out. Almost half of Belgium's euthanasia nurses have admitted to killing without consent, despite the fact that involuntary euthanasia is illegal, and the nurses are not allowed to perform even voluntary euthanasia. So it can affect the medical culture as well. In 2007, approximately 10% of all deaths in the Netherlands were connected to the practice of terminal sedation, and I think we've heard clarity about that today. Many of those deaths were caused by dehydration, and dehydration is supposed to be one of the most painful deaths, to be sort of like denied basic hydration. But the physician sedating the patient and then withholding hydration until death occurs, which usually takes 10 to 14 days. Can you imagine 10 to 14 days without sedation? That's very different than the cases that was discussed earlier, where the body actually can't absorb the fluids. Death will generally happen very quickly there, as far as I understand it. But when it goes on for a longer period, it is euthanasia. So there's another interest. The Grand Duke Henry, the monarch of Luxembourg, opposed the euthanasia law, and as a result, he was stripped of his executive power to veto laws. So very, very strong movement in that particular country. No question asked, Tom Mortier, whose mother was euthanized by lethal injection following severe depression in 2012 in Belgium, is actually taking the case to the European Court of Human Rights, and this is quite current, the European Court of Human Rights, as the Dutch courts refused to give the case a hearing. He argued that his mother, what they did to his mother, he hadn't seen his mother in a while. He hadn't been in her life for a number of years, and then he realised that because she had suffered clinical depression, the family weren't informed about this. So she just had a written request, and he just says, "How can this be right? My mother had a mental illness, a history of depression. We should have been told how bad it was, and we should have been involved in to help her at that time." So what we see in Belgium is a slippery slope. We see the number of euthanasia deaths rising year in, year out since the legalisation in 2002, and very completely inadequate oversight. And this is interesting. The committee that monitors them has received just over 8,000 notifications since the legalisation. And in its history, not one of those 8,000 cases, the committee has submitted not a single one to the public prosecutor. And that's from an organisation called Alliance Defending Freedom. So this is a Dignitas. I think Dignitas is very interesting. I looked it up on the web, and it's amazing what it actually says on the website. It's actually just chilled me to the bone. It's and if any of you've seen the Me Before You film, it was very popular. It was only out, I think, was it this year or last year? And it features a young boy who was a very active guy, very successful young man, a college student, and he had an accident which left him severely paralysed from the neck down. So the story is he ends up sort of having a romantic relationship with his carer, who's a lovely little character in the movie, and but he decides that he wants to go to Dignitas to actually end it all, and his parents sort of support him in that. But Dignitas is presented in sort of quite a positive light in the movie as his choice. But the girlfriend in it totally opposed the choice at the beginning, but then the film ends with her sort of respecting him. But it's interesting, whenever I asked the young people who'd seen it, what did you think? They said, oh, he's so selfish, how could he do that to her? So I don't think it convinced the young audience, who are all for romance and wanted them to have a sort of a life together. But when you look on the Dignitas site, it says, welcome to Dignitas, to live with dignity, to die with dignity, the Swiss self-determination, autonomy and dignity group. We are a not-for-profit member society which advocates, educates and supports for improving care and choice in life's and at life's end. And it ends with, we are the spearhead for the worldwide implementation of the last human right. So this is the type of stuff that you hear. Many who have died, a few facts in Dignitas before we finish off. Many who have died at the Dignitas facility are not terminally ill. Ludwig Manelli, the director, has helped people who are chronically ill, disabled, depressed, or frail or elderly to kill themselves, and has even suggested the relations of the terminally ill could also take a lethal drug cocktail because they're so sad at losing their loved ones, even if they're in perfect health. The Dignitas facility has had to move from the residential apartment block it was located in originally after residents complained about encountering body bags in the lifts. At least 300 cremation urns containing human remains have been dumped into Lake Zurich near the suicide facility Dignitas. And as we can see, the law expands rapidly. So that's Dignitas. It's talked about quite a bit in the media. In terms of the same with the abortion debate, why should so many have to travel over? And really, in fact, the numbers travelling are very, very small to Dignitas. And we know, as with the abortion case, as with euthanasia in other countries, that if the law changes now, the numbers will increase rapidly. So there are just some other sort of very disturbing facts I'll not read you. It's just not very pleasant, let's put it like that. So laws in the Holland and Belgium that were only meant to apply to mentally competently terminally ill adults have been extended to include all these other categories: the elderly, the disabled, those with mental health problems, and worryingly even non-mentally competent children. While in Oregon, the model often cited for those wanting to change the law, there are examples of cancer patients now being denied life-saving and life-extending drugs, yet offered the lethal cocktail of barbiturates. So Dr. Peter Sanders, I think, sums it up very well. There has been, and I'm sure Baroness Nadal might mention this as well in her talk after me, that there have been many attempts to change the law to legalise assisted suicide through the British Parliament since 2003, and all of which have failed, thankfully. In 2015, a motion was defeated by an overwhelming majority of 330 to 118 in the House of Commons amidst real and well-founded concerns over public safety. And I think you can understand that after you've heard the facts and figures today. According to a 2005 House of Lords Select Committee report, a Dutch-type euthanasia law in Britain would result in 13,000 deaths per year. Okay, this is an interesting quote from Leo Alexander, who gave evidence at the Nuremberg trials in 1949. And so he talks about, he said, the Nazi Holocaust began in 1939 with the killing of 6,000 disabled children and 70,000 patients in geriatric and psychiatric institutions. It's amazing that whenever darkness comes, it always hits the disabled and those that are the most vulnerable in our society first. He said its beginnings at first were merely a subtle shift in emphasis in the basic attitude of the physicians. It started with the attitude basic in the euthanasia movement: there's no such thing as a life not worthy to be lived. There is such a thing as a life not worthy to be lived. This attitude in its early stages concerned itself merely with the severely and chronically sick, but gradually the sphere of those to be included in this category was enlarged to encompass the socially unproductive, the ideologically unwanted, the radically unwanted, and finally all non-German. So that's the slippery slope. So an interesting one is, I just wanted to maybe generate a bit of discussion for later on. what do people think in Northern Ireland? You know, somebody said earlier that euthanasia does exist here in different types of forms, and we need to be always alert for it. Certainly it's not legal, but certainly I've heard stories, or I've heard a lot of confusion from families regarding with question marks over how their loved was cared towards the end. And sometimes we can get it wrong from both sides. Sometimes the doctors and nurses were doing the right thing, and sometimes there's just question marks there. And I think one very common practice is increasing morphine and withdrawing hydration. There's a lot of confusion surrounding the appropriate time to take down drip or withdraw other life-sustaining treatment. And I really hope that Eamon and Gavin's presentations today really will have cleared that up. And they're worth looking at if people weren't able to make those earlier talks. They're just worth looking at. There is a crisis in hospital from home care in this part of the world. It's not just in this part of the world, it's sort of UK and Ireland wide. And I think that there's pressure on bed space. There's also a shortage of adequately trained care workers. There's a crisis in the community. I know from my daughter Kathleen, you know, there's a care package, and part of that is you try to get care workers yourself if you can't get them within your family. And thankfully, I'm very blessed to have family members that are able to help me with Kathleen. But out there in the community, there's other families that just cannot get. So we seem to have lost the sense of occasion to care for the sick and the dying. And I think the religious orders are just a huge loss. There's diminishing vocations that original founders, like the Nazareth sisters, like there's others, that actually were founded on that desire to actually care for loved ones for our loved ones that are most vulnerable. And I don't think we realize what a huge loss that is. Pope Francis urged Catholic healthcare institutions and individual doctors. He issued a lovely statement on the World Day of the Sick, which is for February the 11th, which is one of my favourite saints, St. Bernadette of Subaru. Beautiful, beautiful saint. So he urged Catholic healthcare institutions and individual doctors, nurses and staff members to remember the Church's tradition of generous care for the sick and renew their commitment to continuing that kind of loving service. And especially in the World Day of the Sick, he said, we cannot forget the tender love and perseverance of many families in caring for their chronically sick or severely disabled children, parents and relatives. The care given within families is an extraordinary witness of love for the human person, and it needs to be fittingly acknowledged and supported by suitable policies. And I feel very blessed to be part of a church which has as its centre the dignity of every single human life, from conception to natural birth. And there was a beautiful thing happened in Pope Francis very early on in his pontificate, where you remember he was out among the crowds, and there was this wee disabled boy, and he just sprung out and just gave him a big hug. And I just think that that he's always very much goes to the margins, goes to the ones that society often looks down on. And I think that's something beautiful about his pontificate, his ability to do that. So what can we do? Well, help inform others. Challenge elusive language when you hear things like what I've shared earlier. Ensure that our elderly sick or are terminally ill that we know about are getting the best care possible. Ask questions, really ask questions of medical staff, because unfortunately, though the vast majority of medical staff do a great job, they're not always on the same wavelength as what we've heard here today. I don't know what's happening sometimes in the ethical training of medical staff, but they're not always in the same wavelength, and so many come from other countries with very different cultures as well in terms of the dignity of human life, and we need to just be aware of that. And we must ensure that the plan of care is not intentionally life-ending, and every human person, as we know, is deserving of love, dignity and care. And just finally, I just finish with a quotation by a girl that I came across, and I think it's a beautiful quote. This particular person's a writer, and I certainly wouldn't agree with all her viewpoints, but I think she just sums it up when she says that in a society that is deeply uncomfortable with incapacity and disability and sees ageing only as a terrible decline, legalising euthanasia would be a sinister victory for the forces of Western individualism, one which will tear at the fabric of our collective humanity and our responsibility to the greater good. Because ultimately, which is so right here, the assisted dying legislation creates different categories of human life. Some worth living, some not. It's a law not about how people should die, but about whether people should live. And the state should have absolutely no say in that. And that's finish off. Thank you very much.